Good morning and welcome to Thursdays with Culture Talk. I'm Teresa Agresta, and I am here this morning with my lovely co-founder and business partner. She likes to say partner in crime, Cynthia Forrestman, who is also my sister. And we are joining you today with another topic that focuses on another angle of workplace culture. Today, we want to focus on toxic workplace culture. That's a topic that, almost in many people's minds goes hand in hand with the whole conversation about culture, is the reactivity to a culture that feels like it doesn't support who I am as a human being, as a colleague, a coworker. Somehow, in some way, when I get to the place of describing my workplace culture as being toxic, I'm emotionally injured. I've already gotten to the point where I feel stung. Maybe I don't want to go to work. Maybe I've become part of the great resignation because I want to find a place that feels more supportive to who I am and my career goals and my potential, etc.
Yeah. I'm thinking too, toxic is kind of a general term. So I'm hoping today we can dig in a little bit.
Right.
Unpack a little bit, what is toxic all about?
That's a great point, because throwing the word toxic out can drum up any number of different meanings. But what it doesn't help with is, how do we shift it? How do we change it? How do we go from being big picture toxic to specifically improving that culture and shifting away from those toxic behaviors and the outcomes? And talk about outcomes. I read this article, it was done in the end of March, posted to CNBC, and it talked about 5 specific things that researchers found when they looked at the topic of workplace culture and toxicity. Yeah. So those 5 things are a culture that's non-inclusive, disrespectful, unethical, cutthroat, or abusive. And they said something that we think we already get, right? But how do you put some dollars and cents to the impact of that kind of behavior? They said it's $1 billion problem.
Wow.
And that we know that the exodus out the door of people are often driven by things that, are included in those 5 categories.
It strikes me too that when someone says, oh, it's so toxic, that it's a culture and an opportunity that by the time it's gotten to that, we've completely written off. Right. That you know what I mean? There's not even a chance that we're going to stay, right? I feel like toxic is used as a word that's beyond hope.
Right.
And so,
and I also,
I'd love to, talk about how does it get toxic and what, how do we shift? Is toxic gone for good?
Right. And I think another important piece of this conversation is what's happening to the individual, whether they're staying in it. And I've observed just an enormous number of people who have left what they describe as a toxic culture and have it take almost a year for them to heal from the emotional scars that they had in that workplace. So that means that even when they move on to the next workplace, they're in a they're kind of in this lesser state. They're healing. They're still sort of they've got wounds. And so someone who shows up with wounds from one toxic workplace, you got to imagine that they're not bringing the best of themselves yet to the new workplace. So it's a problem that kind of has a ripple effect, if you will. One other thing that this article points out is this research, which was done on Glassdoor reviews, found that all kinds of different criticisms of workplaces didn't drag down the culture scores. But these ones, the ones I mentioned around toxicity, had a direct correlation to how an employee or a former employee rated the culture of the organization. So they could have other complaints, about different things going on in the organization and not relate those to a toxic workplace culture. But these things seem to be particularly deep. They kind of struck at a deep level.
Let's make sure we add the link to that article, Teresa, in the comments here.
Absolutely. I'm happy to do that.
Yeah.
So one thing, that also struck me in the work that we do with CultureTalk and working with Archetype is that we have a whole way of thinking about and looking at culture that acknowledges everything's not always rosy, that we can look at sort of two sides of the coin by using the structure and the framework of Archetype and identify where there's either toxicity that already exists or where there's potential to slip and the early warning system maybe that can help leaders to avoid getting those kinds of reviews, reactions, and essentially exodus.
Yeah. Before we even get into that, I just want to comment in general, like, how does a workplace not know it's toxic? How does like a leadership team, for example, feel like they've established something that's rosy, right? That has all the right ingredients? Because I think we should believe that most leaders aren't setting out to create an environment that's toxic. And often there is a disconnect between how a leadership team feels about a culture. In a way, I think it's because they're the one sort of like, aspirationally identifying this is what we're all about. And
they're the cheerleaders for it.
Yeah, right. It's awesome. It's kind of like, when you go to a movie that you didn't like, and you're like, how did the people that made the movie not know that this wasn't
like blinders?
Yeah, I think sometimes when we're the ones creating the experience and we have that aspirational ideal that we're aiming for, that we are having that experience, right? But often that toxicity exists because there's a gap between what we said we were creating and what we said we're all about and what the leadership is living out.
There's expectations.
Yeah, and the actual experiences that people down the line are having. So just want to comment that it's funny because toxic might depend, right, on where you are in the organization and how you're experiencing the organization. And anytime there is a gap between what we said and what somebody really experienced, that is like an ingredient for getting that kind of feedback.
Yeah. And it's a great place to start the search as well, right? One other way to look at this and to start uncovering is by conducting an audit of the culture. At CultureTalk, we have a process, we call it our baseline culture audit, that enables leaders and teams led by a trained facilitator to evaluate what are the culture patterns. What is the profile of the culture? And then once they have that information during a validation process, they're looking at, are these patterns showing up as strengths, or are we operating from what we deem the shadow sides of the culture? And I think in those shadow sides, that's where we find the toxicity. Now, both can be true, right? So a culture could be expressing a pattern, and it's like a continuum. So those expectations are stated on the strength side of the pattern, and maybe many of the policies and behaviors that are in place do reflect those strengths. But that very pattern is what leads to some of the biggest challenges on the other end of the continuum. And that's where we can find the root cause maybe of some of that toxicity. And to add some hope to the conversation, back to your earlier point about, is all hope lost once we identify as toxic? I would say no. The opportunity exists to say, that's what's happening. We can shift our behaviors.
And in every culture, that potential to slip into what we call the shadow exists within whatever patterns you have. So it's not even, it's not a judgment of like you're all or nothing, right?
Completely. Yeah.
Every culture shows up on some, to your point, there's things about it that are working or that are well intended and could work if we become, it's almost like just the recognition that you have the potential as an organization to fall down in this particular way. And I think it would be really helpful for us maybe to give some examples of archetype in an organization and how it might be experienced as a shadow. Because, toxic again is sort of this general label, but there's different ways that things go awry. So Teresa, I know we've done in the past profiling companies that have become known, have established a reputation.
Unfortunately, right? By the time where all of the eyeballs are on them, right?
Right. It's a terrible place to be. But let's talk through, for example, Wells Fargo,
Sure.
The bank here in the US.
Sure. I'm going to just pick one pattern that we could see because it's a well-known case study at this point, right? Probably used for all of the reasons Wells Fargo would rather not be known.
Right.
But for instance, the hero archetype was highly present in the Wells Fargo culture. And it was a culture that was driven by high expectations and big goals, especially for sales. And so the sales team and the sales culture at Wells Fargo rewarded sort of like no holes barred, driving toward, high numbers and, big success in closing new business.
Right.
And if you weren't able to achieve, it also sort of turned its head at what became aggressive and bully-like and unethical behaviors so that you could actually meet those goals and continue to drive higher levels of sales. And so what we see in that is two sides of the hero archetype. On the strength side of the pattern, it helps people to focus on an end game, gets them inspired around a common vision.
A little competition, yeah.
Yeah, right. Some competition, right? They are really fine-tuned to listen for what's the end game, what's the goal, and have the motivation and the drive to bring the team along and inspire people and drive to reach and to exceed and to overcome those goals. So that all sounds really rosy, right?
Yeah.
That sounds really fantastic.
And they were driving great results with that kind of energy, with that hero energy. They were like breaking new ground in banking.
Right. And everyone was looking at them, saying, pay attention, what's happening over there. They're doing, phenomenal. They are disrupting the industry with the, some of the practices they put in place. Maybe we should do those things. Well, later, the toxic aspects of that came into full light. And that's when we heard those internal stories of the, exceed the goals at all costs, no matter what it takes. And that means if you have to push over people, and that became, even if you push over your own customers, the very people that you're supposed to be, doing all these heroics for. Yeah. And so
in the spirit of winning, right? In the spirit of winning, it went awry.
And the win became the big thing no matter what. So talk about unethical, right? So there's some toxicity. So not only did the company, support, exceeding these goals, but they supported doing it in unethical ways as well as ethical ways. And that became a huge part of the norm. Yeah. To behave unethically. Now, they would never have stated, to your point earlier, they would never have stated, oh, we support unethical behaviors. But in essence, what they tolerated was unethical behaviors. And it was driven by that same motivation. And this is where I think people miss the boat and where they go awry, is the motivation was the same. The motivation was to exceed expectations.
Yeah. And I want to make a comment too, because the hero, one of the hallmarks of a healthy functioning hero pattern is we don't just take action, we take principled action, right? So that drive to win carries with it these principles of doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And it strikes me as you're describing it that as that expectation was set, but then some less principled actions were tolerated little by little. It doesn't happen in a moment. It happens over time that
It
little by
erodes.
little we start to slip into tolerating something that maybe doesn't have all that rosy colored stuff. So that's a great example of
Right.
hero archetype and shadow. Did you
Right.
want to say anything else about that? Or I think we could maybe jump into another example of another.
Yeah. What else you got?
Well, I mean, I think we could just pick another archetype, right? And I'm going to use every person.
Okay.
And I don't
Right.
have a specific example of a company, but I want to just sort of establish what is a healthy functioning every person pattern, cultural pattern. So, and where does it have the propensity to slip into shadow? So, in an organization, every person is an energy. It is a behavior pattern that really is got the all for one and one for all. It's like we're all in this together. It's very welcoming. It is, a place where hard work is rewarded, and you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours because we're part of a team. There can be very healthy, functioning teams in an every person organization. But there is a little bit when it starts to slip in the shadow. What happens is that welcoming inclusivity starts to break down into little groups, right? Like this is our group and this is the in group.
You're not in
your group. And so it still has like that welcoming inclusivity, but only if you're in the in group. And so in a breakdown of every person culture, we start to see that splintering. We start to see us and them. We start to see maybe between management and line workers, maybe between departments, this turfdom and this territorialness. And it's coming out of that same energy of like, we're in this together, group hug. It's just that I've made my group a little smaller and I'm now excluding, right? It's a very inclusive type of energy, but now my inclusivity of like pulling this group close has started to leave people out. And so it gets out of alignment with the energy that makes it work, that makes it positive. And it ends up becoming a kind of place where it's like us and them and the blame game of
you don't know what clique you fit in. Right.
Yeah. And so that's the way, for example, an every person culture would slip into shadow.
Right. I'll mention something else too about the every person, because each one of these patterns has multiple touch points or story points that we like to call them. So another aspect of the every person culture is it's okay to raise your voice, raise your hand, to contribute your ideas, and even to contribute your complaints.
Right.
Like there's an open ear to hearing things that aren't going well, or to taking democratic input that gives everybody a chance to say, here's what I think, here's what's important to me. But when that aspect of the every person culture shifts into shadow, what happens is we get a lot of complaining, a lot of raising up of what's not working, an emphasis, maybe even a focus on what's wrong, like the glass is half empty. Instead of the ability to identify what's going well. And so the open door policy maybe becomes abused, and the energy of that can be quite negative.
Yeah.
And so that's another aspect.
Really destructive, really, in so many ways too. So, just in those two examples of hero and every person, and there's 12 patterns, 12 archetypes that we consider as part of the CultureTalk system, you can feel that the potential for toxic is different. The energy of toxic is different in those two different scenarios. And that is where, the opportunity lies. The opportunity in, Teresa described earlier, a baseline culture audit. And if you are a leader that's listening to this and you're like, oh God, I don't want to do a baseline culture audit because
I don't want to know.
I don't want to know if there's toxicity. Really, it doesn't, you do want to know. You want to know, and you want to celebrate both the aspects of the patterns you have. So a baseline culture audit allows an organization and a leadership team to kind of lay it all on the table. What are all of the behaviors that are contributing to whatever patterns, cultural patterns exist in your organization? And there's no right or wrong pattern. But within each of the archetypes, there is the potential for it to be a healthy, functioning version of that archetype. And there's also that potential to slide into shadow. When you do a baseline culture audit, as Teresa said earlier, you might identify some behaviors that are starting to slip. But what a great tool for you and your team then to begin to recognize, oh, wow, if we have high creator energy and we celebrate all these things that creator energy brings to moving our business forward, we also ought to have our eye out, become aware of, have a strategy around keeping in check.
Right, the potential pitfalls.
The potential pitfalls of that same pattern.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are lots of ways in which having that information can help you to develop a healthy culture. So not only identifying what are the potential pitfalls, but having agreements around how will we shift out of toxic behaviors. Yeah. So we do a baseline culture audit. We identify what the patterns are. We align specific behaviors that show up on repeat in our organization. And now they're clearly identified. They're out on the table. Everyone is on the same page. Mm-hmm. And now we have an opportunity to say, how do we shift from doing this behavior? And what would a replacement behavior be like? Because it's one thing to say, don't do this, but it's quite another thing to offer, do this instead. And there is a opportunity for individuals to develop and for cultures to develop and to shift. And that could look like we go from an unhealthy shadow of that archetype pattern to a healthy behavior. We know they're coming from the same motivation, so we've got it in us, right? We've already identified, we've got this.
Yeah.
Or we could orchestrate a shift to a different archetype pattern.
Right, because we have more than one.
Right. So let's go back to the every person and the hero for a second, and let's go back to that, drive to win that the hero is bringing. And what if when the drive to win slips into shadow, we shifted into the strength of the every person and said, well, instead of, being the top dog and driving toward, this high level of success, we paused and said, how does everyone become successful? What action and reward would look like the team succeeds? We succeed together. We succeed along with our customers and our clients. So when we notice those behaviors, we have a replacement behavior that helps us to maintain, objectivity and healthy outcomes that don't get us caught into a huge reputational crisis.
I also think it's important for people to understand that archetypes are non-judgmental, right? So they almost become the shortcut. When we work with our team to identify our core patterns, suddenly we have a language for talking about behavior gone bad, right? We've seen many times in an organization where, the leadership team or some other team is talking about a strategy and trying to move something forward, and they get caught kind of maybe in the shadow for a minute. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden you'll hear someone go, oh my God, there goes our innocent again, right? are innocent, that has this propensity to do X that is not productive.
Right.
So just, I mean, in that expression, there goes our every person, there goes our caregiver, whatever, with that tone of, wait a minute, I think we just slipped
Right.
into a non-healthy state and expression of this. And it's an opportunity, like really quickly, everyone goes, oh, I hear it, I see it. What can we do instead?
Right. Absolutely. And such a positive. I mean, so right, even in that description is this ownership. And I think we see that over and over again. When a team identifies what's happening in the culture, it's not just the leader's job. Everyone has ownership. Everyone contributes. And the opportunity exists for that common language to serve as a, getting back to ground zero, getting everybody back in the right space, in the right frame of mind, and in a positive reflection of what we're trying to create. Because back to your earlier point, leaders don't set out to create toxic cultures. They set out to achieve results. They're excited and motivated to, hopefully bring the team together around achieving results. And so the framework and the common language and the ownership give everybody an opportunity to participate and to, to keep it real. Right.
Yeah. And to keep it, I want to say, we end up talking not about like this leader is bad or this boss is bad, but now we have a way of saying, oh, we have a pattern. And that behavioral pattern is less about, condemning an individual or a team, and more about recognizing that the air we're breathing in this organization has this pattern to it.
Yeah, and it might be playing on repeat.
Yeah, and this pattern can be, we can course correct. So if you are in a workplace where you feel like there's some toxicity that's steeped in, there's a good chance that the people who are running that organization may not see it yet, because they've got their eye on this aspirational thing that they're creating. And so don't give up hope, right? Don't give up hope. If you want to learn more, if you're in a space of influence in terms of shifting cultures or helping organizations, develop cultures that are healthy, happy, productive, thriving places where people thrive. And we'd love to chat with you about what we're doing at Culture Talk and how you can get involved and how you could introduce baseline culture audits,
right?
12 archetype patterns, assessment tools that are validated to measure these patterns, and how we can turn culture into something really tangible that gives us that opportunity to shift, to lift, to operationalize, and sustain the kind of cultures where people thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. If you'd like to be part of leading that conversation, we'd love to hear from you. So we look forward to seeing you again next week. Thanks for joining us for Thursdays with Culture Talk.